right, welcome folks. So with our Biosphere Bites seminar series, we like to keep it to a firm 30-minute hard stop at 12:30 Eastern. So while folks are still logging on, I'll get started on our housekeeping and introduction. So my name is Katie Dar. I chair the U.S. Biosphere Network's Communications Committee, and I also coordinate the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere Network. We're thrilled to have you today for our fourth installment of the Biosphere Bites biweekly seminar series. Today we are thrilled to have Dr. Annika Keeley with us. She's a senior conservation scientist at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and has expertise in ecological connectivity and animal behavior. She will be speaking to us today about the IUCN's connectivity conservation guidelines and the importance of applying those guidelines in biosphere regions. As a reminder, this talk is being recorded and will be posted to the U.S. Biosphere Network's YouTube channel for those who were not able to attend live today. Some general housekeeping. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation. There will be an opportunity for question and answer and discussion following the presentation. Throughout the talk, you're welcome to put questions in the chat and we can get to those during the Q&A period. And we would invite you to introduce yourself and what biosphere region you might be tuning in from today, if that applies to you. In the chat. So without further ado, big thanks to Annika for being with us today, and I'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. And just get organized here. Okay. I think you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
In presentation mode?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, well, thank you for joining the webinar today, and I will talk about the IUCN guidelines for conserving connectivity through ecological networks and corridors. And we're really excited about these guidelines, partially because they are already, or not already, but they are starting to be implemented. And Canada is one of the countries that are really taking these to heart and having a national corridor program where they are trying to or working towards establishing ecological corridors, and other countries around the world as well. The guidelines are all about climate change, biodiversity loss, which of course are interrelated and can be addressed significantly through ecological connectivity. The guidelines are about establishing corridors between protected and conserved areas and the development of conservation networks. And that's something that's right along the lines of what biosphere reserves are meant to accomplish. So I'm really happy to be here and present on these guidelines and hope that they might be useful for your work. Maybe you can develop new projects, and I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards or have follow-up conversations as well. Before I dive into the content of the guidelines, I want to talk a little bit about how the guidelines came about. There has been a lot of work leading up to this document, in particular on how to manage connectivity corridors. Just a couple highlights are the 2003 IUCN publication on linkages in the landscape, which talks about the role of corridors and connectivity in wildlife conservation, a global guide on managing protected areas in 2006 with a chapter on linking the landscape, a global guide on connectivity conservation management in 2010, a concept paper on the legal aspects of connectivity conservation, all of them leading to a resolution at the World Conservation Congress in 2016 that essentially laid out the need for having these guidelines. And in addition to all these publications, documents, and resolutions, starting in 2017, there have been consultation meetings held around the world to formulate the guidelines. We have then considered, combined, consolidated, and synthesized all the input. The writing of the document itself was a group effort too, and involved were 16 core authors, and I was one of them, with Jody Hilty of the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative being the lead. And then there were 38 case study authors and over 150 individual reviewers in 30 countries. So really making the point here that, this is a document that has a lot of input. It's not just a small group of people from the US who came together to write this, but it had a lot of input. It's based on a lot of previous work. So what's the purpose of these guidelines? We're really trying to push forward connectivity conservation. And we're doing this by first consolidating a wealth of knowledge and best practices for connectivity conservation. And this is not really new, but we need this as a foundation. Second, we're basically saying this is what conserved ecological corridors are. Third, we are recommending conserved ecological corridors be tracked by the World Database on Protected Areas so that we will actually know where we have secure protected ecological corridors. All right, let's look at the content of the guidelines. I will go through the beginning pretty quickly because this isn't so new, but we had to establish why we need connectivity. And there are all these different reasons, right? You're probably familiar with them. We have the extinction crisis, anthropogenic activities are expanding around the world, and then we have climate change. And we know that while protected areas are really important, they're not sufficient for stemming biodiversity loss. And, with the Biosphere Reserves system, you know that really well. And so we have to think about how to move from protected areas to large landscape connectivity. And we suggest in these guidelines to do that through ecological networks. There's a lot of science that backs that up. And again, I will not go into that, but we know that protected areas that are isolated will lose species and processes. And we know that movement of individuals and the genetic exchange are important. And we briefly summarize common approaches to modeling connectivity. And so one thing we have seen, this is really interesting, since we have globally settled on a definition of protected areas and the need for biodiversity conservation, there's this incredible increase in protected areas around the world. And of course, with now the Global Biodiversity Framework that was signed by 190 some countries in Montreal in when was that? In 2022, I believe. Now there's a commitment to protect 30% by 2030. But if we look at connectivity, we're doing less well. There was actually a paper that said that only between 9 to 12% of protected areas in the terrestrial realm are connected. It, of course, depends on how you measure that. But the study didn't even take into account, for example, highways between protected areas when assessing connectivity. So truly connected protected areas are even rarer. And if connectivity exists, it doesn't mean that it's secure. And in the marine world, we haven't even been able to measure whether areas are connected, making progress on that though. So one of the things we need to do, because we're working across all the different realms, was to ensure that we have a common language. This is really important for promoting better cooperation, sharing of experiences, and ultimately a more effective conservation. Just as an example of different terms describing a single concept, here's a list of all the terms that are used around the world in English that are mostly synonymous with what we call ecological network for conservation in this document. So I want to highlight a few key definitions from these guidelines. The Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group of the IUCN and the Convention for Migratory Species came to an agreement on a high-level definition of ecological connectivity, which is the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. It's a definition that works well for non-scientists and is understandable. However, we want this document to be for everyone, so we also included a scientific definition that non-scientists don't appreciate so much. The movement of populations, individuals, genes, gametes, and propagules between populations, communities, and ecosystems, as well as that of non-living material from one location to another. And the definition for an ecological corridor is a clearly defined geographical space, so it has to be delineated, that is governed and managed over the long term to maintain or restore effective ecological connectivity. One of the things that was a challenge in the beginning in the connectivity conservation specialist group was that many people said, well, we have already protected areas. We have these other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs in short. Why can't we achieve connectivity through them? And there was a lot of global debates about this, and we had to be really clear that ecological corridors are between protected areas and OECMs. And unlike protected areas and OECMs that have to conserve biodiversity, ecological corridors may or may not conserve biodiversity. The focus is really on connectivity. So protected areas and OECMs can sometimes conserve connectivity, oftentimes they may not. And so we really do need this third leg of the stool. Now, that being said, there are many situations, including in California, where I'm calling from, where linkages, what they're called here, often linkages or corridors also, they are being protected by establishing protected areas in them. So it's difficult to have it really clear cut, but if countries will establish ecological corridor legislation, the goal is that this will be a standard in the future that is a third part of a way of protecting areas as ecological corridors. So in order to frame what corridors were, we needed to talk about the architecture for large-scale conservation. And there's been a lot of discussion of ecological networks for conservation in the ecological literature. And this approach really makes sure that we are managing the landscape at a scale that nature needs to sustain species, and also think about take into account the ecological processes. So we define ecological networks for conservation as a system of core habitats, which can be protected areas or OCMs, connected by ecological corridors, which is established, restored as needed, and maintained to conserve biological diversity in systems that have been fragmented. And this figure here shows a conceptual representation of such an ecological network for conservation. The somewhat chaotic nature really reflects a little bit of reality. But I'm thinking that, biosphere reserves may look just like that. And here you can see the terrestrial protected areas in dark green and depicted as surrounded by human activities. And the OECMs are represented in orange, and the ecological corridors, both that are continuous and those that function as stepping stones, are outlined with the dashed lines in the light green. In this chapter, in chapter 5, we're going into the really important stuff regarding the ecological corridors. And what we're doing here, and I'm not going through all of it, is we define that if you are saying that this place is an ecological corridor, you need to specify what does it need to do, what are the objectives, where is it, how is it going to be governed so that it's conserving whatever the connectivity needs are for now and in the future, and how are you monitoring and evaluating it over the long run. So that's really the key part of this document is, what does it mean? What does it mean to actually establish and manage an ecological corridor? I think I'm going to skip over these, but I do want to talk about mechanisms. So ideally, corridor legislation would occur at national and subnational levels. but that will probably take a long time to get established, although some countries are making good progress on that. So in this document, though, we also talk about other kinds of mechanisms that can get us to long-time conserved corridors, such as land use plans or marine spatial plans and zoning, conservation easements, incentives and disincentives, and also written voluntary conservation agreements with specific landowners. We also talk about that, like protected areas, ecological corridors need to work across marine, freshwater, and terrestrial environments. And the possibility of an air-based or air column ecological corridor is beginning to be considered. If you think about collisions of birds and bats with wind turbines, high-rise buildings, other human structures, Gary, you know all about bats migrating and flying at high altitudes. But currently, airspace ecological corridors are only theoretical, and really future work is needed to determine if they're feasible in practice. And connectivity needs to be conserved not only within each of these realms, but also across realms. There are now quite a few international agreements and bodies that are embracing ecological connectivity, and at the state and regional level, connectivity legislation is becoming more common. There are many states in the US that have connectivity legislation, and others are working on it, so it's really promising. And the purpose of this document is also to ensure that as the process of laws and policies continues, that it's being used as the best available information. And again, it's really exciting that in the US and around the world, we're starting to see countries and subregions moving forward in the development and laws of laws around ecological corridors. And here's just a list of countries that already have the designation of ecological corridors. And just like there's a global database on protected areas, there's an effort now to work with the protected area planet to develop the equivalent for ecological corridors, so that we can begin to track what level of connectivity we have actually conserved. It's being piloted right now with Canada, and hopefully, within the year, this database will be live. I want to really briefly talk about steps to identify and prioritize corridors, because that's really the first step is the planning part. And CLC, one of our focuses is on connectivity conservation and applying the science to plan for corridors. So there's a whole series of steps, which starts with selecting focal species or structural connectivity approaches, assembling the GIS data, assigning resistance values to every pixel in the landscape. And these resistance values essentially show or present the ability of species to move through that pixel in the landscape. And that's the foundation for modeling connectivity. And then we need to define what's being connected, choose the appropriate connectivity model, and create a connectivity map. And then, because there are often so many corridors that cannot all be implemented at the same time, we need to prioritize the corridors and then assess the potential utility of the identified corridors for implementation. So that's a process we are applying regularly and have a lot of experience in, and what is really the foundation for then implementing ecological corridors. What's really important is that right from the beginning, there's engagement of rights holders and interested parties, which starts with defining the settings and understanding the importance of threats to connectivity and creating a vision and scenarios of a connected landscape, and goes all the way to then monitoring and adaptively managing the corridor. So stakeholder engagement is key to the whole process to make sure it actually will happen. One project we are working on right now in a biosphere region is planning for the future connectivity for Sonoran pronghorn. So there's the Sonoran Desert Biosphere region in Arizona, and then in Mexico, the Alto Golfo de California and Pinacate Biosphere Reserve. And the Sonoran pronghorn is being reestablished in the US part, has been reestablished and is thriving in Mexico still. And thinking about connectivity in that landscape for the future is really important. And actually, what we're doing here is modeling connectivity based on the Sonoran pronghorn needs, and then recommending locations for highway overpasses, and also providing guidance on how to encourage the pronghorn to then use the new overpasses. And we started that just last month with a workshop in Arizona involving a lot of different stakeholders from the US and from Mexico, and kicking that process off. And now we're in the modeling phase. And that's all I have for today. And I'm glad to see that we still have time for questions.
Thanks so much for that excellent presentation. We do have some questions already in the chat. Kate, I don't know if you want to come off mute to ask your question, or we can just read it out. So Kate was asking if the need for delineation of corridors happens at the property scale or larger.
So delineation really means a line on the map. So yes, it needs to be clear which properties are in the corridor and which ones are not. We essentially need a polygon, right, to be submitted eventually then to the database on ecological corridors. But that being said, that's the IUCN guidelines, right? If you want to exactly follow those recommendations, that's what it needs. If this causes problems in the landscape because of property owner sensitivities, then they're definitely, I would argue that, take whatever approach makes it most feasible to actually conserve connectivity. And if that very discrete nature is a problem and fuzzy boundaries would be easier, I think, whatever it needs to make it happen, go with that.
Thanks. Cliff, I would invite you to share some information about the link you dropped in the chat.
Yeah, that is the newest release from USGS, the American Conservation Atlas. And I haven't dug into it very deeply, but it just shows activities around the United States. There's a data catalog with it, an interactive map, and it shows different designations and different metrics. You can see that it's a contribution of all the federal agencies to this database. So there's a lot of publicly accessible data in one place, and I think that's the value. And then you can map it through the visualizations on the site. I've been waiting for this for 2 years.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring that. We commented on it early on, but I didn't realize it was released. It's exciting.
Yeah, just last week.
Okay.
Let us know what you think.
Yeah.
John, I saw your hand come up. Do you want to add something there?
Yes, quick question. Thank you, Annika, for the presentation. Did the group discuss how to determine how wide a corridor should be? The length is obvious if it's connecting 2 units of protected areas, but how wide should it be?
That is a good question. And there's some rule of thumb guidance, but it's, it definitely depends on the context. It depends on the objectives of the corridor. It depends on the focal species to keep in mind. It depends on, the landscape context I mentioned already. But in general, if areas are, or two protected areas are more than, I forget exactly the numbers, but if they are more than 2 kilometers and up to 50 kilometers apart, the guidance is that they should be about 2 kilometers wide, but, can have pinch points in them. So in general, overall 2 kilometers wide, but if, it needs to go through a narrow area because it's built up, it can be part of the corridor.
And so the effort to build bridges over highways is challenged by that.
Well, that would be a pinch point, right?
Right, exactly.
You would have a 2 kilometer or so wide corridor leading up or with that one crossing in the middle
Yes.
or somewhere in the corridor,
Yeah.
and with fencing guiding the animals to it.
Thank you.
John Allen had a question in the chat about how we think about connectivity for barbell species like passerines versus large roaming territorial species.
That's a good question. I mean, again, it depends on, well, I think for passerines, for birds, often what works well is also the stepping stone connectivity. So the corridors don't have to be necessarily continuous, but as long as the species can, move from one patch to the other and they are close enough to facilitate that movement, that works quite well. So corridors, and that's part in the guidelines too, they don't have to be continuous depending on the objectives of the corridor. They can be stepping stone corridors.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm on my phone. I'm sorry. So I've got a question, and I'm not an ecologist, so I may have misunderstood, but you had mentioned that the ecological corridors do not necessarily, let's say, enhance biodiversity, and it just sort of seems to me that they just somehow automatically would. Can you like say an example of where that doesn't happen, or why that wouldn't happen?
Yeah, so what it says is that they don't focus on in situ conservation. The focus is really on making sure there's connectivity. And an example could be that, some of the mobile species might do quite well moving through agricultural areas. And so just making sure that those areas remain agricultural and not being built up, developed for, with housing and industrial development, that would already make sure that connectivity remains for those large mobile species. But it doesn't really promote in situ conservation of other species. That would be one example.
Yeah, great. That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Looks like we have one more question in the chat. Tom Gilbert has a question about the political implications of corridors.
Can I go?
Just a second. I'm opening you up here. There you go.
Thanks. I'll do this as quickly as I can. Sovereignty International Incorporated was chartered primarily to counter the influence of IUCN with the United Nations. And they did a lot of damage over the years. And one reason they did a lot of damage was wildlife corridors that were described by Reed Noss. And they made a map that convinced the Senate that human activities were going to be so restricted in these wildlife corridors that the Senate voted not to ratify the Biodiversity Treaty. And that hurts even today. And programs like the 30 by 30, the US can't participate as effectively as it should.
And already some members of Congress have written to the president to warn of the dangers to property rights and U.S. sovereignty and all of that. I think this is not adequately considered. I dealt with Henry Lamb and that group for about 10 years. Henry died 2012, and we did make some progress, but that is definitely a danger today that needs to be considered. One other quick thing is that Raymond Dasman, when I went to UNESCO in 1973 and 74, he was a good friend, an outstanding ecologist, and the one who described the biotic provinces of the world, and why we at UNESCO got them to list the national parks and equivalent reserves in those provinces. And it gave a very broad picture about conservation needs. Some years later, I did a new map, and it would be really interesting today to do the same thing, take those original biotic provinces and plot the national parks and equivalent reserves that exist today.
That would be really interesting. And really quickly about the political implications of corridors. I think what we have learned by doing mistakes, making mistakes, is that the stakeholder engagement early on is really, really important, right? Before anything is delineated or planned or anything, or even modeling started, need to get the people in the landscape on board and, you know, convinced that that connectivity is important for their landscape, right? We're doing that for the people living in the landscape as much as for the animals. And doing that outreach early on, before even starting the planning, and getting them also understanding then once we do the planning, what goes into that. And I think that's really the key process that needs to happen, so they don't feel threatened by corridors. And also knowing that there are quite a few examples where the corridors are going through working landscapes and people can contribute but are not limited, you know, not regulated. Having those examples is really helpful.
Thanks. We're a little soft on our hard 12:30 deadline today, but that's okay. That was a really good question and comment to end on. Thanks, Annika, for your presentation, and folks for joining us today. I put in the chat the link where you can stay up to date on the upcoming Biosphere Bites talks, access recordings, and submit suggestions for future talks. The next one's coming up on May 8th and will feature a conversation between Sarah Gaines and Tom Gilbert about the role of biosphere regions in peace building. So hope you can join us for that one, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Fine. Thank you, everybody.